afternoon, Dr. Stoltenkamp and the members that are joining us. I will be doing a very brief input on what I call the broader transformative project of UWC, and within us looking at the theme of societal impact. I think it was during academic week, the last day of academic week 2021, I did a keynote address on the interconnectedness between higher education, internationalization, and society, and pointing out how important it is that as a university, any higher education institution, that we cannot operate in an acontextual fashion, and that whilst there might be competing interests, that we do not need to make false choices if we are seeing our academic project as part of the broader transformation goals of our country and of our democratic society. So if you go to the next slide, please, Cornell. A few thoughts. One of the ways in which one can have this careful balance that I referred to, if you look at that picture, is to ensure that in our institutional thinking around the broader transformation project at UWC, that it must be reflected in all aspects of the institution. So whether we're talking about our governance system, our management and leadership at all levels, whether we're talking about the student environment, we often speak, and as you know, with Operation Student Success and Pumelela, for example, at UWC, there's a huge focus on access and academic success and retention of our students. And then, of course, and linking this to Prof. Chetty's argument that he made, it's also linked to how progressive and inclusive our learning and teaching environment is, our approach, our graduate attributes, whether they are acontextual. Fortunately, I can say even our current graduate attributes, which need to be tweaked in light of the changing world of work and our changing society. We are already including in those graduate attributes, for example, a local and a global engagement in what we would like to see in our graduates. But then also taking it beyond learning and teaching, because you cannot divorce this from curriculum transformation and renewal. And as I mentioned in the previous session, our curriculum transformation and renewal framework is on its way to Senate. And even in that, in the CTR framework, we've ensured that there is a direct link to our communities, our societies, and the impact of that within the broader transformation project and decoloniality. Then, of course, things such as institutional equity in our staffing, institutional culture plays a very important role, because if you have, you know, the old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, you can have the best laid plans, but if you don't have the kind of institutional culture that fosters and actually live the values of the institution, then you could have beautiful plans on paper, but it actually would not be, won't come to fruition. And then I think we need to be mindful of the one at the bottom. We have to bear in mind the political economy of higher education funding and the unevenness even in our system. And Prof. Chetty alluded to that as well. So if you go to the next slide, please, I just want to remind us a bit of our policy mandate and where community engagement and especially societal impact would really fit in. I want to remind you of Education White Paper number 3 of 1997, which has a fourfold purpose as follows. For education should meet the learning needs and aspirations of individuals. Secondly, to address the development needs of society. Thirdly, to contribute to socialization of enlightened, responsible, and constructively critical citizens, and contribute to creation, sharing, and evaluation of knowledge. Now, we've touched a bit on the sharing and the co-creation of knowledge, but I think what I want to remind us of is actually there's a very express purpose that we find in Education White Paper number 3, which links then for the public good, for the common good, And this is where I see our community engagement and societal impact being the nexus, in a sense, between learning and teaching and research. And therefore, Prof. Chetty, when you ask why we don't have a third deputy dean, I think it will be counterproductive to have a third deputy dean in all faculties. Why? Because then you're separating community engagement out from learning and teaching and research. Although we do have it in the two clinical faculties, especially CHS and dentistry, but that's because it's also linked to clinical education. That's in passing. So when one looks at this policy mandate, also the 2001 National Plan for Higher Education, and I want to emphasize the words that you see in italics. It emphasized the need for responsiveness to regional and national needs for academic programs, research, and community service as those three core pillars of HE. And in my view, these legislative frameworks lay the foundation for higher education institutions to consider their role in what we call SIBI, societal broader impacts, through the following: responsive education. So how responsive our curriculum is, for example, would be a key indicator. Our research that we are doing and whether it impacts through, whether it's applied research or whether it is participatory research that was mentioned earlier, or even our fundamental research, and if it has an impact on society. Engagement for citizenry, and I'm mentioning this word because it actually also draws us back to that critical and constructive and responsible citizens that I mentioned in relation to the 1997 white paper 3. And then, of course, you cannot do community engagement if they are not equitable multi-stakeholder partnerships. Equitable, that word is actually quite important. So regional and national strategies. And in the academic week, I made the point that we must remember that we are actually rooted on the African continent. And whilst we're talking international, there should be, even in the way in which we engage our communities through our partnerships, also be a very, very intentional connection with our own continent. The next slide, please. So how's it scholarship? Without going into the detail on this slide, I will refer now to a mode 1 and a mode 2 of knowledge production, but suffice to say that if you look at the Carnegie Foundation CE definition, it emphasizes, I think you can go back to slide mode, please. It emphasizes collaboration, mutual beneficial exchange, and partnerships towards addressing inequalities. And that's why I made the point that even in our own CE principles at UWC, we do not research at communities, but co-create knowledge with communities. So CE really relates to a range of work that we can call engagements. And it's not typically the argument that we're making, that it's not only your communities, civil society, Cornell referred to that earlier, but our scholarly community, our student communities, civil society, industry, international community, and then of course those regional communities as well. And then engagement must then find its place, as I said, as a nexus between these three and bringing them all together. And that is why we refer to the scholarship of engagement that infuses learning and teaching, research and service or engagement, if we go beyond the normal understanding of community engagement. So when you can go to the next slide very briefly, the big difference between your mode 1 and mode 2. The mode 1 is very focused on disciplinary knowledge, and it's very discipline specific, clear distinction between whether you're doing fundamental research, for example, or whether it's applied. But the one that's very exciting for us is the mode 2, which focuses on distribution of knowledge to broader society. And it requires a different form of knowledge production. It's much more reflexive, socially accountable, problem-oriented, multi- and transdisciplinary. And it requires of us as HEI scholars and the students to actually become practitioners with our communities when we search collectively for solutions to societal challenges across disciplines with all the relevant stakeholders. I was just chatting to Dr. Jacob Kluter to say that it's not always just finding solutions to societal challenges, but I see my role as engaging with the community also as telling the stories of the community. So my last book called Stemmer from Clarkson, I actually did that with the community to tell their story of the community Clarkson at the foot of the Sipsikama Mountains where I hail from. And that's another form of community engagement and taking the scholarship much further. So mode 2 requires of us to make sure that it encompasses all forms of scholarship. So whether we're talking about scholarship of discovery, integration, and in the booklet, you would see that we follow Boyer's model. And Prof. Daniels has explained that very well in the booklet, how we actually share in an interdisciplinary fashion our knowledge and in the scholarship of application from theory to practice. On this slide, briefly, what has been very interesting in us looking at, and especially also I chaired the USAF conference session on community engagement, looking at the Engaged University, and what became quite clear is that it's only more recently where universities are looking, HEIs are looking at more structured and ways and specifically geared towards assessment and measurement of the SOE impact. I think we can do even better in this space, especially if we also want to make sure that not only do we use the, benefit in a mutually beneficial partnership with our communities, but also when it comes to the impact rankings, and we need to have that conversation separately. But it's also interesting that it's no longer enough to say that we're promising that your academic research and training or education will be of benefit to society. So if one looks at the corporate social investment funding, if you look at, say, we mentioned here the Department of Science and Innovation, organizations are looking much more to an explicit way, intentional way, and how they can boost socioeconomic development and improve well-being of all citizens, and not just based on a future promise that eventually the work that we're doing will be able to benefit, but much more intentionally. And therefore, I'm of the view that the legislative frameworks and the policies that we have, they do lay the foundation for HEIs like ourselves to consider our role in SI and BI through responsive education, through our research, our engagement for citizenry. And I want to make sure here that when we talk about citizenry, that we link it back to the 1997 white paper number 3, to say that it's responsible and constructively critical citizenship that we contribute to in our society. And that we can only do through equitable multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I think we at UWC, with the work that we've been doing in this space for the last 5-6 years, we are really well poised at the moment with our scholarship of engagement being embraced, and with the development of a formal framework for this at UWC, we will be uniquely positioned, because what the courageous conversations showed me that we've had, not only with the communities, but also our alumni, is that number one, community engagement is really in the DNA of UWC. And secondly, if we want to make a more meaningful societal impact, we should harness that and make it even much more intentional. So the long and the short of it, community engagement and scholarship of engagement is not a choice at UWC. It should be part of what any academic and those in professional support services strive for, and that we don't outsource that responsibility to someone else. With these few words, I hope that it would at least paint some picture of how we see, or at least in my opinion, we see the broader transformation project of UWC. Thank you, Chair.